You're driving home after a long day. The flashing red and blue lights suddenly appear in your rearview mirror. You pull over, roll down your window, and hand the officer your license and registration. Everything feels routine. Then, without raising his voice, the officer smiles and asks one simple question. Do you mind if I search your car? Not, I'm going to search your car. Not, step out of the vehicle. Just, can I search your car? At that moment, most people make a decision in less than 3 seconds. And for many, it's the biggest legal mistake they will ever make during a traffic stop. Because once you say one simple word, yes, everything changes. Your Fourth Amendment. Protections may be affected because you've voluntarily consented to the search. The officer no longer has to rely on certain other legal justifications for that search. The surprising part? Many people don't even realize they had a choice. They believe they were being ordered. They believe saying no would automatically get them arrested. Or they worry that refusing makes them look guilty. But that's not how the law works. Today we're breaking down what really happens when police ask for permission to search your vehicle. Why officers often ask instead of simply searching. And the one mistake that legal professionals repeatedly warn people to avoid. This isn't about disrespecting police officers. It isn't about creating conflict. And it certainly isn't about hiding evidence. It's about understanding your constitutional rights before you're standing on the side of the road trying to remember them. Because once consent is given, you usually can't take it back after the search has already happened. Why officers ask for permission? Here's something that surprises many Americans. If an officer already has legal authority to search your vehicle under a recognized exception to the warrant requirement, they generally don't need your permission. So why ask? Because consent is one of the simplest legal grounds for a search. Instead of arguing later about whether probable cause existed, instead of explaining why another exception applied, a voluntary yes can become a key part of the legal analysis. That's why the question is often calm, professional, friendly. Mind if I take a quick look? It'll only take a minute. If you've got nothing to hide, it shouldn't be a problem. Those words aren't necessarily a threat, but they do create psychological pressure. Most people don't want to appear uncooperative. Nobody enjoys standing on the side of the road with traffic passing by. The natural instinct is to end the encounter as quickly as possible, so they agree. Not because they fully understand the legal consequences, but because saying yes feels easier than saying no. And that's exactly why understanding the law before the encounter matters. Because decisions made under stress are rarely your best decisions. The law doesn't judge what you intended. It often looks at what you actually said and did. And during a traffic stop, a single answer can shape everything that happens next. Why consent is different from a police order. One of the biggest misunderstandings during a traffic stop is the difference between a request and a lawful order. When an officer asks, "Can I search your car?" many drivers hear something completely different. Their brain translates it into, "I have to say yes." But legally, those are two very different things. A request gives you a choice. A lawful order generally requires compliance. The problem is that stress makes it difficult to recognize the difference. When you're sitting behind the wheel, your heart is racing. Police lights are flashing behind you. Cars are speeding past. An officer with a badge, a uniform, and a firearm is standing next to your window. Even if the officer speaks politely, your brain naturally feels pressure. That pressure causes many people to mistake a question for a command. And that's exactly why consent searches happen so often. Why police often prefer consent searches. Let's look at this from the officer's perspective. Imagine you're conducting a traffic stop. You'd like to look inside the vehicle. One option is to establish a legal justification that allows a search under the law. Another option is much simpler. Just ask. Because if the driver voluntarily says, "Sure," the situation changes immediately. Instead of debating legal authority, the officer may now rely on the driver's consent as the basis for the search. That is why officers sometimes use relaxed language like, "Mind if I take a quick look? It'll only take a minute. You don't have anything illegal in there, do you? We're just trying to clear things up." None of those questions automatically mean the officer is doing anything improper, but they do create an environment where people often agree without realizing the legal significance of that decision. The biggest mistake people make. The biggest mistake isn't necessarily saying yes. It's saying yes because you think you don't have a choice. Many innocent people believe refusing consent automatically makes them look guilty. So they think, if I refuse, the officer will definitely think I'm hiding something. That belief causes countless drivers to waive rights they never intended to waive. Here's something important to remember. Having constitutional rights does not by itself make someone suspicious. The Fourth Amendment exists to protect privacy, not just innocence. Rights are exercised by innocent people every day. The existence of a right would mean very little if people were punished, simply for choosing to exercise it. Why people try to explain too much. Another common reaction is over-explaining. Instead of giving a simple answer, people start talking. There's nothing in there. You can check if you want. I was just coming home from work. I don't know why you'd want to search. I've never been arrested. The problem is that every additional sentence creates additional information. And once information is volunteered, it becomes part of the encounter. That's why legal professionals often recommend keeping interactions calm, respectful and focused rather than trying to convince an officer that you're innocent through lengthy explanations. Because during a traffic stop, the more you talk, the more opportunities there are for misunderstandings, inconsistencies, or statements that may later be interpreted differently than you intended. Sometimes, the most important decision you make isn't what you say. It's recognizing that a polite request and a legal obligation are not always the same thing. When police can search without your consent. At this point, some people ask an important question. If I can refuse consent, does that mean police can never search my car? The answer is no, and this is where many people become confused. The Fourth Amendment protects you from unreasonable searches. It does not mean that every vehicle search requires your permission. There are situations where officers may legally search a vehicle without your consent, depending on the facts and the law. For example, courts have recognized certain exceptions to the warrant requirement, such as when there is probable cause to believe evidence of a crime is in the vehicle. There are also other circumstances that may allow a search under U.S. law. The important point is this: if an officer already has lawful authority to search under one of those recognized exceptions, your refusal does not automatically prevent the search. But your refusal also does not create legal authority that didn't already exist. That distinction matters. Why consent still matters. Imagine two different traffic stops. In the first, the officer asks, "Can I search your car?" The driver immediately replies, "Sure, go ahead." In the second stop, the officer asks the exact same question. The driver calmly says, "Officer, I do not consent to any searches." Now, what happens next depends on the facts of the situation and the law. If the officer has independent legal authority to search, the encounter may continue on that basis. If not, the lack of consent may become an important part of the legal analysis later. Notice something important. The driver's response doesn't determine whether the officer has lawful authority. It simply makes the driver's position clear. And clarity is important. Don't try to out-argue the officer. One mistake people make is turning the roadside into a courtroom. They start quoting legal terms they barely understand. You don't have probable cause. That's unconstitutional. I know my rights. The problem is that a traffic stop is generally not the place to argue legal issues. If there is a disagreement about whether a search was lawful, that question is typically resolved later through the legal process, not on the shoulder of the highway. That is why many attorneys recommend staying calm, avoiding arguments, and communicating respectfully. Being respectful does not mean giving up your rights. And exercising your rights does not require being confrontational. The power of a clear response. If an officer asks for permission to search your vehicle, your response should be simple and respectful. Many legal educators recommend saying something like, "Officer, I do not consent to any searches." That's it. No long speech, no accusations, no raised voice, no debate. Just a clear statement. Then allow the officer to make whatever lawful decision he or she believes is appropriate. Because once you begin arguing, explaining, or trying to negotiate, the encounter often becomes more complicated than it needs to be. Sometimes the strongest response is also the simplest. Clear, respectful, and consistent. Because knowing your rights isn't about winning an argument. It's about understanding where your rights begin and where the law draws the line. The psychological trap most drivers fall into. By now you've probably noticed something. The most effective police questions are rarely the loudest ones. They're the calm ones. The ones that sound like ordinary conversation. Imagine an officer smiles and says, "Come on, it'll only take a minute." Or maybe he says, "If there's nothing illegal in your car, why not let me look?" At first, those words don't sound threatening. In fact, they sound reasonable. And that's exactly why they're so effective. Because instead of making you feel forced, they make you feel guilty for even thinking about saying no. Your mind immediately starts racing. If I refuse, will the officer think I'm hiding something? Will this make the traffic stop longer? Will I look suspicious? Those thoughts don't come from the law. They come from pressure. And pressure changes how people make decisions. Why innocent people often say yes. Here's something that surprises many people. The majority of drivers who consent to vehicle searches aren't hardened criminals trying to outsmart the police. Many are completely innocent. They simply believe cooperation means agreeing to everything. They think refusing a search automatically creates problems. So they say, "Go ahead," not because they understand the legal consequences, but because they hope the encounter ends faster. Unfortunately, that's not always what happens. Once consent is given, the search may become much broader than the driver expected. And by then, changing your mind may not undo what has already happened. That's why legal professionals often stress understanding your rights before you're under pressure, not during the stop. The nothing to hide argument. Perhaps the most common phrase heard during these encounters is, "If you've got nothing to hide, why not let me search?" At first glance, that sounds like common sense. But legally, that's not the question. The Fourth Amendment wasn't written only for people hiding something. It was written because the founders believed privacy itself deserved protection. Think about your own vehicle. It may contain personal documents, prescription medication, family photographs, financial records, work equipment, private conversations stored on devices, items that reveal details about your daily life. None of those things are illegal, but they're still personal. Privacy isn't evidence of guilt. It's a constitutional principle. And choosing to protect that privacy does not automatically mean someone has done anything wrong. Keep the encounter simple. One of the biggest mistakes drivers make is trying to convince the officer that they're a good person. They start explaining where they've been, where they're going, what they do for work, how they've never been arrested, why they're in a hurry. But none of those explanations necessarily answer the officer's request to search the vehicle. Instead, they create more conversation. And more conversation often leads to more questions. The simplest approach is usually the clearest one. Stay calm, stay respectful, avoid unnecessary explanations, and understand that protecting your constitutional rights doesn't require hostility. It simply requires knowing that a polite request for consent is exactly that, a request, not automatically a legal obligation. The moment everything can change. Imagine the officer asks one last time, "So, you don't mind if I take a quick look inside your car?" At this point, many drivers start second-guessing themselves. The silence feels uncomfortable. Cars are passing by. The officer is waiting for an answer. And suddenly, the pressure isn't coming from the question anymore. It's coming from the silence. Most people hate awkward silence. Our natural instinct is to fill it. So they begin talking. I guess that's okay. Sure, if it'll make this easier. Go ahead. I've got nothing to hide. Those words may seem insignificant, but legally, they can carry real weight because they may be interpreted as voluntary consent. That's why understanding the moment before you answer is so important. Don't let emotions make the decision. Traffic stops are stressful, even if you've done absolutely nothing wrong. Your heart rate increases, your hands may shake, your thoughts become scattered, and under stress, people often make emotional decisions instead of informed ones. Some drivers say yes because they're afraid. Others say yes because they're embarrassed to refuse. Some simply want the encounter to end. But constitutional rights are not meant to depend on how nervous you feel. They're there to protect everyone, whether you're calm, confused, or under pressure. That's why legal educators consistently encourage people to know their rights before they need them. Because once you're standing on the shoulder of the road with flashing lights behind you, it's much harder to think clearly. The power of a respectful response. If an officer asks, "Can I search your car?" there is no need for a speech. No need to argue. No need to accuse the officer of violating your rights. A calm, respectful response often communicates your position more effectively than a long explanation. Many attorneys recommend wording such as, "Officer, I do not consent to any searches." Simple, professional, respectful. Then allow the encounter to continue according to the law. If the officer has legal authority to search independent of your consent, the officer will act based on that authority. If not, your lack of consent is clearly stated. Either way, you've made your position known without escalating the situation. Knowledge is your greatest protection. The biggest mistake during a traffic stop isn't always saying the wrong thing. Sometimes it's not understanding that you had a choice in the first place. The law can be complicated. Traffic stops happen quickly, and decisions made in a few seconds can have lasting consequences. That's why learning about your constitutional rights before you're ever stopped is so valuable. Knowledge helps you stay calm. Knowledge helps you avoid panic. And knowledge helps you make informed decisions instead of emotional ones. Because at the end of the day, the strongest protection you carry in your vehicle isn't hidden in the glove box. It's the understanding of your rights and the confidence to exercise them respectfully when the situation calls for it. The one mistake you should never make. After everything we've covered, one lesson stands above all the others. The biggest mistake isn't driving the wrong car. It isn't looking nervous. It isn't even being stopped by the police. The biggest mistake is giving away your constitutional rights simply because you didn't realize you had a choice. Every day across the United States, thousands of traffic stops begin exactly the same way. An officer approaches the driver's window. The conversation starts politely. License, registration, insurance. Everything feels routine. Then, almost casually, comes the question, "Do you mind if I search your car?" At that moment, many people stop thinking about the law and start thinking about the officer's opinion. Will I look guilty if I say no? Will refusing make things worse? Maybe it's just easier to agree. But constitutional rights were never designed to disappear simply because a situation feels uncomfortable. They're designed to protect everyone, especially during uncomfortable moments. The simple response legal experts often recommend. If an officer asks for permission to search your vehicle, many legal professionals recommend keeping your response calm, respectful and direct. A commonly recommended response is, "Officer, I do not consent to any searches." Nothing more. No argument, no raised voice, no accusations, no lecture about the Constitution, just a clear statement. Then allow the officer to decide what action to take under the law. If the officer has independent legal authority to search, your refusal doesn't erase that authority. If the officer does not have that authority, you've made it clear that you did not voluntarily consent. That's why those few words can be so important. Don't try to talk your way out of the stop. One final mistake deserves attention. After refusing consent, some people immediately start talking. "But I've got nothing illegal. You can trust me. I'm just coming home from work. I promise there's nothing in there." Unfortunately, every additional sentence creates additional information. And once information is volunteered, it becomes part of the encounter. The goal isn't to convince the officer that you're innocent. The goal is to avoid creating unnecessary issues through nervous conversation. Remaining respectful doesn't require endless explanations. Sometimes the strongest communication is also the shortest. The bigger lesson. This video isn't about encouraging conflict with law enforcement. Most police officers perform difficult jobs under challenging circumstances. Understanding your constitutional rights doesn't mean treating officers with disrespect. In fact, the two can exist together. You can be polite, you can remain calm, you can follow lawful instructions, and at the same time, you can understand and exercise your constitutional protections. Those ideas are not opposites, they work together. Because the Constitution wasn't written only for lawyers or judges. It was written for ordinary people during ordinary encounters. So if you ever hear those words, "Can I search your car?" take a moment before answering. Don't let fear answer for you. Don't let pressure answer for you. And don't assume that a polite request is automatically a legal requirement. Know the difference. Stay calm. Be respectful. Understand your rights. And remember the one simple line that legal experts often recommend. "Officer, I do not consent to any searches." Those words are not about hiding anything. They're about understanding that constitutional rights only protect people who know they have them and choose to exercise them. Because in the end, the best way to protect your rights isn't through an argument on the side of the road. It's through knowledge, preparation, and calm decision-making. Long before those flashing lights ever appear in your rearview mirror, the more you understand your rights today, the more confident you'll be if that moment ever comes tomorrow.